back to another episode of Cherishing Scripture Podcast, a podcast where we're changing society by cherishing Scripture. My name's Zach. Today I'm here with Jeremy, Jesse, Dr. Bailey, and Nathan. How are you guys doing?
Great, man.
Doing well.
Great.
Hey, I feel pretty good sitting at our new table, don't you guys?
Looks nice.
It's nice,
It
big.
actually turned out better than I thought it would.
Yeah, that's what we
I
all
was really
thought.
surprised.
Now, I don't know if I take that as a compliment, Pastor, or as
I
a
take
you
it
had
as
doubt
a-
in us. But
Even the
It
girls
looked
were
great.
like,
It looks really, really good. That's the bottom line.
looks good.
yeah, his
we like
wives
it.
thought they looked better than what we thought too.
Yeah. Well, anytime Nathan and I get on a project, people get kind of worried, so
Yeah.
it's okay, though. It's all right. It turned out all right. But today, we're back in Galatians again, and we're going to try to get back to going verse by verse or section by section through a book of the Bible. And we're going to try a little bit of a different method today where we actually go verse by verse and we try to pull out the main thought or highlight a main thought that is found in that and go over these step by step. Now, to remind you, it's been a while since we've been in Galatians. To remind you guys about verses 1 through 5 in Galatians, Paul is writing to the church of Galatia because they are dealing with Judaizers. They're dealing with people trying to bring law into the church, and they're trying to add to salvation. What we call today is legalism. And it was a very real issue then, and I believe today through our talks we'll see that it can still be a very real issue today. But today for our text, we're actually found in verses 6 through 10. So Jeremy, why don't you go ahead and read those verses out for us?
Yeah. Start with verse 6. It says, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there will be some that trouble you, and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we, or an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel unto you, that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. As we said before, so now, for do I now persuade men or God, or do I seek to please men? For if I yet please men, I should not be the servant of Christ.
That's a pretty powerful text, and especially to roll in. You know, Paul's really good about giving some pleasantries at the beginning, but he gets straight down to business here in Galatians. And it's a very pressing issue. If you want to see how pressing it was for Paul, in verse 6, the second word that he says is that he marvels. He's just dumbfounded, as some would say, that they would be so soon removed to another gospel. So that tells us that he's saying that it's so soon removed, that this is obviously a very young church. They've just now started to get the gospel out there, and they're already being removed from that gospel. So Jesse, why don't you give us a little bit of history here? Tell us, what is this other gospel that Paul was talking about?
As far as the immediate context, they're practically not even, I'm gonna just say, halfway through the first century after Christ had been ascended. There is historians that say that the book of Galatians could be even the second, as far as chronologically written down, that the book of Galatians could be the second in order as far as the New Testament books that were penned down. And it goes with that astonishment. Paul is perplexed. Paul is angry. And I would too. If I had done what I did, it started way back in the book of Acts, chapter 18, what he had done going through that land, going through Galatia, and plowing as deep as he did, going through the culture and setting them up for a success and setting up for a win. And when he is gone, he hears immediately that there is another gospel. And Jesus said that that don't be, I think it's I think it's John said in 1 John, he said there are already many antichrists among us already. And that's practically almost the end of the century.
Mm-hmm.
And imagine where we are today, 2,000 years later, 20 centuries. This is a synergetic effort by Satan. But back in Paul's day, to have just a hard time dealing with another gospel is mind-boggling. But as far as another, the word another there is another of the same, or another of a different kind. Heteros is another of a different kind. And verse here in verse 6, he said, I marvel that you're so soon removed from him that called you. Him. Listen, God calls men to himself. The preacher is just that mouthpiece. The Christian is just the mouthpiece. God calls men. He said in 1 Thessalonians, he has called us unto the gospel of his glory. And in 2 Thessalonians, he's called us unto this kingdom. It is God's calling through men. And he notices that there is something else calling men away from the truth. And he has to put an end to this. And in verse 7, beginning in verse 7, but let's finish verse 6. He said, to him that had called us unto the grace of Christ, unto another gospel. Another, different, a different gospel has come up in society, in our world, and is calling Christians away from God. And in verse 7, which we'll get back into verse 6 in a minute, verse 7 says, which is not another. It's not another. This word another here in verse 7, the beginning of verse 7, is another of the same kind, the right kind. Allos, the right picture that is pictured here of Christ, grace through faith alone. And Paul said, if any man, if any angel, if any creature, if anybody brings a gospel, let him be what? Accursed. And right. Paul saying, why is that? Why is that such a major issue? Can we have a altered gospel? No. Can we have a tainted gospel? Can we have, and what kind of gospel is this? Is gospel plus works? Is grace plus works? That is every other cult, every other religion has works sprinkled into it. And ours is the only religion where God himself supervises, superintends, supersedes, who supernaturally powers the gospel or the message and the messenger to say it is God and nobody else who he's getting glory for this supernatural act of salvation or is behind this religion, which makes us and the gospel of Christ particularly exclusive. And Paul knew that, and he is fighting for it. We should know that. Jude knew that, and Jude, and I think it's in verse 3, he said, I was going to talk to you about just regular salvation and just edify you and encourage you, but I have to talk about fighting for the faith, not faith, the faith, definite article, because it is a definite, specific, talking about the scriptures. There is, the doctrine of God is under attack. It has been under attack then. It is under attack now. And because once you start meddling with the gospel, listen, salvation and its true message becomes powerless. It loses its power. Right. No man cannot be saved with grace plus faith. It is grace and faith alone. And Paul knew that. It is not a gospel plus something. It is not another heteros. It is not another gospel. It is the gospel, which he says here, which is not another. There is one gospel. And Paul says here that we must definitely deal with this. He's marveled. He is, as Brother Taylor mentioned, perplexed. There is just this dumbfounding that Christians, listen, we are sheep. We are pretty ignorant, but at the same time, we are easily led astray. And we need to get back to the hub of what the true gospel is, which is faith and grace alone. Back to you.
Yeah, that's good. Nathan, did you have something to add there?
No, I think Jesse said it pretty wonderful there. That was
good.
That was good, Jesse.
And yeah, it really does give the idea. I mean, this is something that happened. Pastor, do you know when about the book of Galatians was written?
Around 60.
Yeah, some people, there's been some debate about whether Galatians was early in Paul's ministry or later in Paul's ministry. And to tell you the truth, I don't know for sure. There's debate, you said 60 AD. I've heard that date thrown out there before, but it seems to resemble the early fire of a younger Apostle Paul. That's what it seems to resemble, because the book is in every chapter so confrontational. Right. His later books, like Romans, were more compassionate, very much tender in their message and so on and so forth. So I would tend to believe that it would be somewhere before AD 60, but I'm not totally confident of that, and most people steer away from making any kind of a conclusive statement about exactly when the book was written.
Yeah, but it's safe to say that this book is definitely over 1,900 years old.
Yes.
That's safe to say. And let me ask you a question, Jeremy. Do you think that there are any other gospels in today's society?
Preparing for this podcast episode, I went actually looked up different types of gospels that are in our world today. And I found a few, I found a few, and I'll actually link this site that I found in our YouTube and on our others. But I found 5 ones that we're all common with. We all know. Preacher mentioned one this morning, the prosperity gospel, praying the sinner's prayer, and then doing some kind of act of faith, and where you kind of God just blesses you with blessings on earth, and it's when that shouldn't be our main goal. Our goal should be focused on heaven. And then there's another one I liked. I didn't like it. I'm not saying we're going to do this in our church now. This is another one we see a lot more of, and that is the God is only love gospel. I found that one too. That one is kind of big with a lot of our riotings that we're seeing nowadays, a lot of our gay pride rallies that we keep seeing. All of them talk about God is only love and no hate. And
that's an incomplete gospel.
Yeah, a very incomplete gospel. And then, of course, you have those claim to be gospels who don't have Christ at all, which is very dangerous. But I'll definitely link this site that I found.
And then, to think of more, there's a works-based gospel that you
Jehovah's.
just have to. How many people do you meet that say, oh, no, me and the big man upstairs, we got this settled. All I got to do is be a good person down here, and then when I get to heaven, it'll all work out. I just got to outweigh the scales, is how they'll put it. They'll say, when I get to heaven, my good's got to outweigh my bad. That's definitely, there's a few there. And I think if we just sat down and talked about the other gospels that we see, there are many, many, many more. And the sad thing is now in good Christian churches, they're starting to seep in as well.
This site was actually good. It had a lot of different ones for you to think about and stuff we should be careful of ourselves. So I'm definitely going to link it in there. But one thing we need to remember, and Jesse kind of mentioned it, but our gospel is a Christ alone gospel, a faith alone gospel, and a grace alone gospel.
Yeah, our gospel says that there's nothing good that we can do to ever earn heaven.
James talked about it.
Right.
A lot of times you see heresies and false doctrines. They don't just naturally arise to where, the God is only love. Those are sort of conclusions to the matter. But if you go back to, the 2nd century, 3rd century, you have doctrines or heresies like Sabellianism, Docetism, monophysitism, adoptionism, and all these attack the nature of Christ. Either they're with his deity or with his humanity. They weren't linked with the church. They kind of separated off themselves, and they're presenting another Christ. Well, we know the scripture says, "Who is a liar, but him that denieth Christ?" I think it says, or "Who is Antichrist? Him that denieth the Father and the Son." Mm-hmm. And so, I know Galatians is directly towards to the Judaizers of grace, but when you talk about another gospel type deal, I think you have to include these heresies that attack Christ, and while they still want to cling to Christ, we say, no, you have the wrong Jesus.
Right.
We can't link arms with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are some. There are some. I want to make sure we're clear on this. There are other denominations that we can still fellowship with. I know Pastor's mentioned before he has several Pentecostal friends, and then there are others. I don't want to get out and just start naming denominations, but there are other denominations that aren't ours that we agree with. But when we can't agree on the person of Christ, or we can't agree on the gospel, for example, I have family that's Pentecostal, and I know that they're saved, but then there's also Pentecostal churches that believe that you have to be able to speak in tongues in order to be saved. That's a sign of salvation, and that's not something I agree with. It's not something that the Bible speaks on, but you can see this in many branches, and it's sad because, as Jeremy said, some of them are as simple as God's only love, and people are blindly following this, believing that God's only love, living their best life now.
Yeah.
And then when they get to heaven and they stand before their maker, they're going to realize that it's just not the case.
That's what kills me about those people is they don't know the God of the Bible that we know. Like Pastor said this morning, we serve a God who will kill people. He's not just love. And even though he is a good God and he is a definitely loving God, but people just don't understand the true nature of our God.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah, that's true. And it's something we have to remember. God is love. He is graceful. He's merciful to us, but he's also a judge.
Yep.
They call him the righteous judge. So he is all of these things. And we can't leave out one aspect of God or Christ and not pervert it. If you try to leave out any part, you're really going to mess up the gospel message.
You're creating another gospel.
Exactly.
Yeah. As far as comparison, 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians were in deep moral decay and defection, morally, and Paul showed compassion toward them. He said, "You're ignorant." And what did he do? He preached doctrine, and he saw change. He saw it took a while, buddy. It took a while, and they were in deep. But he had compassion toward them. But there is no mistakes. I believe God allowed him to come, if that might have been a young, brash Paul, to come in at that age with some fire and some grit, because there has to be a definite cutting edge when it comes to dealing with Scripture, and there is no compromise. We cannot, and there is no, I hate to say, we can't mingle. We cannot open our arms, and we cannot have this ecumenical ideology when it comes to mincing our Scripture and our message with the world and its message. And when it does, it ultimately damns people to hell. And it's sad that there are churches that preach an incomplete gospel, that do not teach everything that needs to be taught when it comes to a complete gospel, and then there are those that add to it. And there is punishment, great punishment, as the book of Revelation says, to those that add or take away the words of the Scriptures or this prophecy.
That's right.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Now, Nathan, the next question for you here is, how can we identify false gospels and those who teach them? How can someone today, not everybody is a seminary student. Not everybody has that ability. How can a common Christian find a way to identify false gospels and those that are teaching them?
Matthew 7:15 is an important passage. And I'll read down to verse 20. It says, "Beware of false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them." And that's the thing about all these heresies and all these false gospels. They may prosper for a certain amount of time, but within 100, 200 years, they disappear because they're utterly false and they have no basis to them. And every sort of new cult or new heresy that arises is just an old one resurrected. So, like Mormonism, that didn't start back with Joseph Smith. That fundamental idea about being God's and the end of all things, all these sorts of ideas, they had their beginnings, and you can see their fruits. Their fruits are number one, lies, because they cannot preach these messages without indoctrinating somehow a lie into the people. Right. And it's very shady. When you cannot ask questions, that's when problems start arising. When you cannot approach a pastor or someone who is supposed to be in a position of leadership, and you cannot approach them with questions, then that should raise an eyebrow. Like, man, maybe something's up. Or maybe they do answer your questions, but they never give you a source to where they get their information from.
Which is pretty much opposite of the way Jesus was approached by men.
He always referred back to Moses.
Yes.
He always gave sources for his informations. And, Jesus was God, so he did several times, command the authority. And even when referring to Moses, he says, Moses said this, but I say unto you so and so. But none of these false teachers are Jesus. So, I mean, it's important to get text for where your information is coming from. And as far as the false prophets and false teachers, they don't have, your best interests in their heart. They want to use and abuse you. Most of these prosperity gospel people are in it for the money. And then even if you go back to the Judaizers, they didn't want to they didn't really care about these Gentile people. They wanted to enforce their own ideologies on them and make themselves feel better, make it seem like everyone wants to follow after what they're doing, and which is dangerous, very dangerous to be a wolf in sheep's clothing and be a pastor of the church, because I think judgment's going to be hard on them, very hard.
Better believe it.
Yeah, I definitely do. And that's one thing I've always actually told myself, like when I see these people preaching another gospel, like I think to myself, like hell is going to burn so much harder for someone like that that's willing to lie and deceive people, to take people down the wrong road knowing that they're doing so. And it's sad. It is really sad because you see these people, they're speaking as if they have the power of God, but they don't have the blessing of God in it. They're saying things as if it's Bible, but like Nathan said, when you ask them to back it up or to show you where it says that in the Bible, where do they get this from? They can never really back it up or stand on it. They just say, well, it's just that way.
Yeah.
Or you shouldn't question me. Why would you question the man of God? And things like that. And that's where it gets very dangerous. Actually, in fact, Pastor, you've written a book altogether on toxic traditions and talking about certain things that can seep into a church.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Cherishing Scripture Podcast. Well, due to the length of this podcast, we've had to cut the episode in half, but if you tune in next Friday, you can catch the rest of this podcast as we dive into this section of Galatians. You can find us anywhere on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, Overcast, Pocket Cast, and Radio Public. And again, you'll catch a new episode every Friday. If you have any questions for any of us, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at CSPodcastCrews@gmail.com. I'll attach that down to the link at the bottom if you would. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, if you would, just comment, subscribe, and like. And we'd love to see you here at Brandon Baptist Tabernacle. Come by and visit us. Our address is 1118 North Parsons Avenue, Brandon, Florida. Again, we hope you've enjoyed today's episode of Cherishing Scripture Podcast.